Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the Blazor Desk Show. I'm Carl Franklin. I'm going to be talking all about Blazor for the next couple of hours. We're going to start, with some cursory information and some basics, and we're going to dive in pretty quickly to actually what's going on under the hood and what this is all about, and basically helping you decide, first of all, whether you want to use Blazor in your projects, and secondly, which hosting model do you want to use. So let's jump right in, shall we? Before we get much further, I want to publicly thank DevExpress for sponsoring the Blazor Desk Show. This was originally the Blazor Road Show, and of course we had to bring it inside, right? Because that's exactly what happened. Yeah, the coronavirus happened. Anyway, DevExpress has been in the business of helping developers be more productive for 20 years. They started with Delphi controls, and they're still supporting those controls. In addition, of course, they have lots of other controls and components for developers for you to use. But one of the things that they have now is some free Blazor controls that you can go and download now and use forever, by the way. These aren't limited in any way. They're not going to expire. They will work. The thing is that you'll have to talk to DevExpress about what the model is going to be going forward, but it'll probably be some subscription model. But right now, go get the goods. Go get the free stuff. devexpress.com/free Blazor. John and Don are in the chat rooms, so if you have a question about their controls, or if you have a question about Blazor, while I'm doing my presentation, go ahead and ask it in the chat rooms. So the agenda is pretty cut and dry. I'm basically going to share everything I know about Blazor. I've been doing this now, since last year, and have built a lot of software with it. Now, it's going to come fast and furious at you, but don't worry, you don't need no FOMO. There's no fear of missing out here, because everything that I'm telling you, including this slideshow, is available for download at blazordeskshow.com. You're going to get the source code, and you're also going to get a hands-on lab that guides you step by step into building the software that I'm going to show at the end. So what is Blazor anyway? Let me take a sip of my .NET Rocks coffee and figure that out. Well, it is important to address this issue because a lot of people think that it's C# running in the browser. And while that is certainly a feature of the client-side hosting model, that is not really what Blazor is all about. It started out that way. Steve Sanderson did a little WebAssembly project with C# a couple of years ago, and everybody freaked out. And we saw where it was going, right? But Blazor is today a component model for the web, a UI component model for the web. So Blazor itself, you could think of as a SPA framework, much like Angular is, or React, or Vue, except that the component model uses the C# language. And that's good. If you are a JavaScript person and your company has invested a lot of money in Angular and all that, and you got your team, rock on with your bad self. That's good. JavaScript is obviously doing very well for companies and for the people that master it. But there's a whole section of enterprise developers out there that do not like JavaScript and never really took to it all that well. But you're going to have to make up your own mind. All right, so we're going to talk about the component model. There's two hosting models. In other words, there's two types of projects that you can create. One is a WebAssembly Blazor project where all the code runs in the browser, what you would typically think of as Blazor. And the other is a server-side model. And the server-side model, all the same code runs on the server. How about that? And there's some magic that happens in there, and I'll talk to the magic and tell you what it's all about. We'll actually watch the network traffic, and we'll see exactly what's going on. The same markup in code in this component model can run in either place. It can run in a Blazor WebAssembly app, and it can run in a Blazor server app. There is no such thing as an app that does both. Okay, maybe there is, but they'd be two different projects. Okay? Whenever you create a project, you create an app, which is a unit of publishing and all that, you're either going to have to pick a Blazor server architecture or a Blazor WebAssembly. You really wouldn't want to mix them because, remember, this is a UI framework for single page applications, right? So this isn't a replacement for Web API, right? That's not what it's all about. It's all about UI interactions and binding and event handling and dealing with all of that stuff. Okay, Blazor is not Silverlight. There, I said it. I feel better. I feel the tension in the room just going away. Blazor is not Silverlight, kids. Let's talk about Silverlight for a minute, shall we? First of all, enterprise developers loved Silverlight because they could write in their language for the web. And we all had high hopes that this was going to be able to let us write applications in the browser that you could see on mobile phones and on iPhones and iPads and Macs and Linux and Windows machines and all of that. And it became very, very popular in a very short amount of time. So the reason why nobody uses Silverlight anymore is more to do with the plugin model and Flash than it has to do with Silverlight. So at the time, just before its demise, and we'll talk about that, Flash was very popular, and it gets into the browser using the plugin model. The plugin model turns out to have very significant security risk problems. So at the time, Steve Jobs noticed that people were complaining that their battery wasn't lasting, and they pinned it down to Flash. People were watching movies with Flash. By the time the movie was, halfway in, the battery is dead. So that was problem number one. Also, malware was finding its way onto iPhones and iPads through the plugin model. So Steve Jobs basically said, okay, on iPhones and iPads, the Safari browser will no longer support the plugin model, which means no Flash. Also means no Silverlight. But Flash was the big problem for him. So Silverlight's demise, really, and you could still write for it if you want, but the problem is it isn't going to run anywhere, so nobody writes for it. But the problem with it is because it used the plugin model, which is what we had back in the day. So the only similarity between Silverlight and WebAssembly, C# or Blazor, is that you write C# code and it runs in the browser. Other than that, it's completely different. WebAssembly is baked into every browser except those that aren't, that stopped being developed before WebAssembly. But every browser, even Safari iOS devices, can run it. In fact, I just wrote an application in Blazor Server yesterday with a Signal hub to allow somebody to go to a website, enter in a GUID or a password or whatever, and then be able to control a PowerPoint presentation remotely in the browser on my iPhone. And it works. It works great. So WebAssembly is there. It's there. It's everywhere. And it is sandboxed. It's just like JavaScript. And it opens up the world of languages to browser programmers. It's not just JavaScript anymore. Okay. And when I say Blazor is not Silverlight, I'm saying Blazor WebAssembly. WebAssembly is not Silverlight. All right. So first of all, if you want to create a Blazor server application, just go ahead and do it. Use the latest version of Visual Studio 2019. Blazor server and everything in it shipped with .NET Core 3. So you can go ahead, light up Visual Studio, and you've got yourself a Blazor server application, no problem. WebAssembly is still in preview. Preview 3 just came out literally last week, and it's got some new features, and it came with a new community edition, a new preview edition of Visual Studio that's got some bugs, but you can work around it. Of course, it's a preview edition, right? So this document right here tells you how to get this WebAssembly template up and running in Visual Studio Preview. You need to install the latest .NET Core SDK 3.1, install the latest Visual Studio Preview, and then you install the Blazor WebAssembly template from the command line. And the instructions are right there. You could just Google Bing Blazor WebAssembly Preview 3. You'll find it. All right, so let's talk about these different hosting models. We'll start with Blazor Server. And remember I said that there was some magic in there? Well, yeah, there is. Let's actually pull up Visual Studio right now and create a Blazor application. And I will call this Blazor Server. So as I said before, you can do this with Visual Studio today. You don't need any previews for the server app. I have installed the Blazor WebAssembly template, so that's why I have the option of also running a WebAssembly app or creating one. But I'm just going to go ahead and create it. And just run. Right out of the box, you get this sort of little demo that you can obviously modify, and I could show you all of those little tricks of how to modify things so they don't have that Blazor look about them. Here you go. So there's 3 pages here and a nav bar, a little about at the top. This is some static information right here with a link to a survey. And then we have this interactive page, counter, where you can click a button and the counter increments. And next we have fetch data. So this is in Blazor Server, this is just calling a local class to load some data. Now let's actually put a breakpoint here in the counter page. You can see right there we've got counter.razor as one of our pages. First of all, let's take a look at what this magic looks like here. So I have a code block where I've defined an integer current count, and I have a method increment count that adds 1 to it. And then I have this current count value displayed up in the HTML with the Razor syntax, that @ sign. And I have a button, and the @ sign in front of onClick tells you that this is a Blazor onClick, not a JavaScript onClick. Take that button away, and now the browser is looking for something, a JavaScript method called increment count. So how does this work? I mean, this looks like magic, doesn't it? Put a breakpoint there, click the button. There it is. Running on the server. This is obviously in the browser. How do we get from button click to increment count to updating the browser? There's no plumbing code here, is there? Well, the answer is SignalR. There is a SignalR hub built into .NET Core 3, ASP.NET Core 3, Blazor stuff, that gives you a one-to-one communication mechanism between the server and each client. It's a persistent connection, right? So it's different than your typical HTTP request. An HTTP request, basically, when you click a button or do anything that has to go to the server, like your typical AJAX request, right? Makes a request over a socket connection over port 80. The server says, hi, how are you? And a little handshake and all that stuff. And here's my request. I process the request. I run some code. and then I send an HTTP response. And then the server severs that socket connection. SignalR keeps the connection lines of communication open. So it can push data to the browser, and we can send things from the browser to the server very easily. So let's go back here and run this again without the breakpoint. And I'll actually pull up the browser tools here and go to network. Make sure that if you want to do this at home, make sure the cache is disabled. And I'll start recording events here. And I'm just going to press Control F5 to reload that whole page. And looky here, not a whole lot of stuff. Look, in fact, let me zoom in down here. Only 161K transferred. But look at this guy. Let me move him over. Time type. That's what I really want to see. Look at this guy right here. Underscore Blazor question mark ID equals some identificator. Do you like that word? Identificator? And that's a WebSocket. That is the connection to SignalR. And I can actually open that by clicking on it, and you'll see all the messages. Yes, this Blazor pack is the protocol that they're using, that they actually created a protocol, binary protocol to send data back and forth. So let me clear all this and click the counter button, and then we'll look and see. Well, what happened was there's a JavaScript file that loads with every Blazor application, and that JavaScript hooks the DOM, says, this is a server-side call. It wraps up a binary message. In this case, it's 291 bytes. And that goes to the server via SignalR. Server says, oh, well, that is, that's an increment count that I have to run here now, right? So it calls increment count on the server, and then it notices that there's a change to the DOM. And how does it do that? It actually keeps a graph of the client's DOM, the document object model, in memory for each client. And then it gets a diff of what it was before it ran the code and what it was after. It says, oh, well, obviously this element right here needs to update. That's a UI element. And so then the server sends back another message, 148 bytes. The DOM is updated in the browser, and then a little acknowledgement, little 27-byte message. I mean, I don't know exactly what that is, what that contains, but it looks like an acknowledgement to me. And all of these little 3-byte things are just simply, keep alive, hello, I'm still here kind of things. So that's it. I mean, that's essentially what's going on under the hood. SignalR is the magic that makes this whole thing happen. All right, so this is exactly what we just did. Oh yeah, on this slide, advanced logging of SignalR traffic. There's a blog post that I wrote that if you want to actually take a look at the messages themselves, what they say, you can turn on some logging in Visual Studio. There's a couple ways to do it, but this is just an exploration on my part. I'm just grabbing screenshots as I did interactions and see what all the data is that gets sent back down, back and forth. Pretty cool. All right, let's talk scaling, shall we? Because if all the code is running on the server, and it is here, then that server, we need to pay attention to how much memory it has and how much CPU it has, because that directly affects how many concurrent clients we can have online. I'll give you some numbers in a minute, but first of all, 85K, about 85K is required per concurrent connection, meaning every client that is connected via SignalR. Okay, so that's even before you put any data on a page and send data to the client. That's minimum. All right. Therefore, you want to minimize how much data you keep around at any one time. And just means, don't send millions of rows of data to a select list box and expect to have a lot of users. WebSockets are also a precious resource, and SignalR limits that based on available memory and CPU. Now, there's a link there to a GitHub document telling you how to use Azure SignalR service in your application instead of the SignalR hub that comes in your server application. All right, so that's a good way to completely take the SignalR story out of your application and move it. All right, I told you I would give you some numbers. Here are some numbers. This is the results of a test that Microsoft did in a slide that Dan Roth, I pilfered it from .NET Conf. They basically did a test with this application. It was a real application. It wasn't just a button counter click thing, but they did have buttons. And they were testing for appropriate latency, which is less than 200 milliseconds. In other words, how can we tax this machine? How many users can we put on here before the time between my click and a response is more than 200 milliseconds? And with two different server configurations, they got different results, obviously. The first one had one virtual CPU and 3.5 gigs of RAM, and it could support 5,000 users comfortably. If they upped that to 4 virtual CPUs and 14 gigs of RAM, 20,000. And that is without a SignalR service. That's just what's in the box in that one machine. So available memory is pretty much the primary bottleneck. We're going to talk about scaling out. This is scaling up. We'll talk about scaling out, which requires state management in just a minute. So let's talk about the pros and cons of this hosting model versus WebAssembly. On the plus side, download size significantly smaller. All right, you saw it was like 160K for that one page because the code isn't in there, nor are assemblies that need to run that code. Also, the app is running on the server, so you have all of the things that .NET Core gives you on the server side. Not only that, but you have access to databases and cloud services that require authentication, that require keys. All of that stuff is completely doable on the server side because it's running on the server. You don't need to hide those things from the client because the client will never see them. And this is a benefit to some, I'm not so sure, but the application code itself is not shipped to the client like it is with WebAssembly. Again, I don't think this is such a big deal. I mean, it depends on what you're putting in that code, right? So on the WebAssembly side, yeah, your code gets sent in the form of assemblies to the browser. And the user can find those assemblies and decompile them and see what you're doing. But you know what? You have the same problem with JavaScript. And it doesn't even need decompiling. Yeah, you minify JavaScript. It's harder to understand what it's doing. But the fact of the matter remains that if you're doing it right, you're not putting secrets in JavaScript on the browser. Whether it's JavaScript, whether it's WebAssembly, the code that runs in the browser should only be UI code. That's it. End of story. All right. The downsides of Blazor Server. There's added latency because of that network hop required to SignalR for every UI interaction. That's every checkbox, every list box selection, every button click, any kind of UI reaction, right, needs to go back to the server. There's no offline support. So if your network goes down, your app just stops. It stops working. And, good thing that there's like some a semblance of an error message that pops down at the bottom of the page. But your app will just stop working. The buttons don't work. The nav bars don't work. Like nothing works. Scalability issues I just addressed in the previous slide. And of course, it does require an ASP.NET Core server to serve the app. So There's no going to a CDN like you can do with WebAssembly. All right, so I'm going to take a minute to make sure that your questions about Blazor Server, the hosting model, are answered. And again, Don Webier and John Martin are in the chat rooms, and they're looking for you. They're looking for your questions. Looking to see if there's a simple way to do JavaScript focus yet. Yes, I have a solution for that, and I will be showing it to you. And I think Don said that. Yes, he did. Okay, and if you have any more questions, just go ahead, pipe up, and Don or John will be happy to answer them for you. Let's talk about the client hosting model. It's a bit simpler because there isn't this round-trip magic SignalR stuff going on. It's just code running in the browser. Now, as I said before, WebAssembly is baked into all modern browsers, and it is not going away. It isn't something that anyone has any interest in seeing go away. In fact, it just opens up opportunities for more languages, right, to run in the browser. And so Golang runs on WebAssembly. Rust runs on WebAssembly. Now C# does too. Python, there's a Python compiler for WebAssembly. Basically, anybody who makes a compiler for a language can target the WebAssembly binary, right? Just like you would have you would compile an application for Windows, or and those files have a .wasm extension. What's interesting is that most languages that run on WebAssembly today are hard compiled to binary WASM files. Whereas Blazor WebAssembly, the only thing that's compiled to a binary WASM file is the CLR. And that mono cross-platform CLR runs on WebAssembly, and then it hosts all of your assemblies, just like it does, the Common Language Runtime does in Windows on the web. It's managed code. So we have managed C# running in the browser. Garbage collection, all of that stuff is in there. So let's do the same thing that we did with the server, and we'll pull up the network tools and see how it compares. Now I'm going to just add a solution to this, add a project to this existing solution here. It will be a Blazor app, but it'll be a WebAssembly app. So I'll call it Blazor WASM. Okay. Now you're going to experience another undocumented feature of the latest preview of Visual Studio. Where did my Blazor WebAssembly template go? Well, if you select .NET Core 3.0 and then .NET Core 3.1, it comes back. Fear not. Now take a look at this. We have support for progressive web applications and also this option, ASP.NET Core hosted. So progressive web applications, you get the skeleton files for that, which is a manifest and a service worker that you can modify to your heart's content. But it is enough to, if you're running it from a browser, to install onto your home screen on a phone or another device, or even on an operating system, a desktop operating system. This ASP.NET Core hosted, we're actually going to check that off. And what that does is it gives us another project, a server project, that hosts the client project. So I'll show you what I mean here. This right here is the Blazor WASM client. So that's going to run in the browser, and you see you have your pages and your Razor files. And this is the server that hosts it. So here we have the opportunity to publish controllers, API controllers, that can be called directly with relative URLs from the client. Also, we get this shared .NET Standard project, a library essentially, that has models. So those models can be served by the server and used by the client. both client and server have a reference to the shared project, obviously. So let's just make Blazor WASM server our startup project. Yep, there it is. And run again. And we'll take a look through the network tab and see what all is coming down to us from the server. Okay, there we go. Looks pretty much the same. There's our hello world, there's our counter, our fetch data. But let's just go back to, let's say, the counter page. Press F12, get our network tab open, disable the cache, and now press Control F5. Whoa, that's a bit different, isn't it? Let's see how much data was transferred. 6 megabytes. Holy megabytes, Batman. That's a lot. Well, first of all, no, it's not really a lot. I mean, I'm not saying that I want it to be 6 megabytes. It doesn't have to be. But, you know, Gmail gives you 5 megabytes right up front. It all gets cached in the browser, but the user is in charge of that cache ultimately. If they press Control F5 or they go into settings and remove, you know, clear the cache, then it has to be downloaded again. The reason that it's 6 megabytes, and if we sort by size here, you'll see, is that MS Core Lib, which is the base class library, or most of it, is 1.3 megabytes. It's because the linker is off by default in this latest preview in debug mode. When the linker is on, it links out all of the stuff from the base class library that's not being called. It only sends down what is actually going to be used. So what I'll do is I'll turn this from debug mode to release mode where the linker goes on, and you can also set that in a setting in your csproj file. I'll run this again, and we'll compare. Hey, we'll compare, like we're up in Maine or something. Turn on that network sniffer. Hit Control F5 again. Yep, we still got a lot of stuff, but this time only 1.9 megabytes were transferred. Okay, so it's not so bad. The baseline isn't so bad at all. And now you can see MS Core Lib right here. Let's see how big that is. It's only yeah, 518K. Because we're not really doing a lot. But let's sort by size again and see what the next biggest file is. And it turns out it's the CLR. .NET.WASM. All right, that is the WebAssembly binary that allows you to load and run all of these assemblies in the .NET framework. Now, compatibility, any .NET Standard 2.0 assembly, anything that complies to .NET Standard 2 is going to run. Simple as that. Now, the way that .NET Standard works is that the lower the number, the more compatible it is. So AppVNext, my company here, we are actually shepherds of the Poly project, which allows you to express policies for transient error handling. And Poly is a .NET 1.0 or 1.1 .NET Standard. I think it's either 1.0 or 1.1. And so that means it's running in Blazor, and we have, you know, people using it on Blazor WebAssembly right now. It's pretty cool. The possibilities are endless, I tell you. So let's talk about the ups and the downs of this model. On the benefit side, well, the code executes more quickly because it doesn't have to run, we don't have an extra delay to go back up to the server for every UI interaction. There is offline support. So as you saw, the progressive web app support is right there, and with that you can cache things, so you're not constantly going back to the server for them. And if you're offline, you can actually read the last version of that data from the cache. You can also write to local storage, as I said before. You can distribute a Blazor WebAssembly application on a CDN. So unlike the server side, which requires an application server, essentially, you do not. And as I said before, any .NET Standard 2.0 compatible C# will run in the browser. Now the downsides, you have to write an API layer for everything that you want to do where sensitive code runs. As I said before, the only code that you want running in the browser is UI code. You want to make calls to an API to do things. Maybe you're downloading some data from a database. Great. It's just a web API call. Maybe you're accessing data with a service, an Azure service or an AWS service. Doesn't matter. That's going to require an API call because you don't want keys and tokens and things like that going down to your browser. You want to keep that to a minimum. Debugging in Visual Studio is still not 100%. I mean, yes, you can put breakpoints in there, and you can do some cursory stepping around, but it's not quite there yet. This latest preview that just shipped a couple weeks ago, or a week ago now, a couple weeks ago, I can't remember. Anyway, it just is the first one. It's the first preview that supports debugging, so that'll get better. It's still in preview, and it says until May. So what I mean by that is, in May, the plumbing code behind a WebAssembly application will be baked. Right now, they still are deciding on a few things and trying to get other things to work with it, so the plumbing code might change. But here's the thing, the component model is baked. The component model, any code and markup that you write that can run in Blazor WebAssembly today will run on Blazor WebAssembly in November when it ships with .NET 5. That's when it's going to be released. However, once the May drop comes, that code, you could consider that code complete. Again, downside, your code is shipped to the client. I had to put it in here because some people are concerned about it, but I just think that sensitive code should run on the server, just like you would do with JavaScript. And, we're in the same sandbox as JavaScript is in here, so it's not really a downside, but, I kind of had to put it on there because people are going to ask about it. Got to set them straight. All right, so it looks like we have some more questions. And Don is doing a really good job of fielding them here. Some people say that Blazor Future will be something like Silverlight. Do you agree with that? All right, I think I addressed that pretty clearly. No, it's not. First of all, the idea that Microsoft killed Silverlight is silly. Okay? The plugin model killed Silverlight, and it was going to happen sooner or later. So the hackers that found how to exploit the plugin model killed Silverlight. WebAssembly is there. It's here. It's here to stay. It's not going away. It will only get better. And again, it has the same security restrictions that JavaScript has. It's just a different language. So no, I don't agree. I can see how people could conflate Silverlight's past with WebAssembly's future, but it's ill-conceived. It doesn't make any sense. The only thing they have in common is C# running in the browser. Okay. Okay, looks like that's the only question. So keep asking those questions, Don and John. We'll get to them in the chat room. All right, let's talk about binding. And the binding syntax in the component model is, I think, really, really elegant. Now, I'm not going to read this slide to you, so let's jump over to Visual Studio again. And we're going to, I have set Blazor server back as the startup project, and I've gone back to debug mode here, and we're going to hijack the index page. Going to get rid of all that, and I've got some code here that we can use to test out binding. So first I'll show you what it does, and then we'll talk about the code itself. So one-way binding is just this. You know, you have the @ sign, the message, like a label. We're just showing some data. Two-way binding means I get to change it. Now, by default, with an input box, if you don't specify what event triggers the binding update, you know, triggers whatever you're bound to update, by default, in an input box, it's onChanged, which happens when I lose focus. So I'll hit the tab key, I lose focus, the binding updates, and here's the code. So input @bind equals message. Message is a private string property. So essentially, when the onChanged event occurs that I tab off of, this is going to update message, which then shows as a one-way bound label. Now I can specify which, and it's the default property because I haven't specified a property. The property is value. But if I can change the event that does the triggering here by saying @bind event equals on input. And that essentially means on every keystroke. Now every time I press a key, it will update the message. Which, by the way, this is in Blazor server, so every keystroke is going back to the server. Okay? Now, if I want to be more explicit, I can specify which property I want to bind to. By default, it's value. But here I can be more explicit and say bind message to the value property. And if I do it there, I also have to do it here. So this is the same code, except that if you omit dash property name, it uses the default property. All right. Now we're going to do something fun and create a component, because I want to show how, I mean, the component model is all about building components and using those components and reusing those components. And you can even package them up as assemblies and share them. You can make NuGet packages out of them. In fact, that's what DevExpress has done with their packages. They made a NuGet package, and it has all of these components that you can just instantiate, just like we're creating this input box right here. So let's create a component called child component. I don't know, it just came to me. And we'll put it in the pages folder. Normally, they would go in the shared folder if they were going to be reused, but this is just a demo, so just to prevent me from requiring another using statement if I need it. Child component. So what I did is right-click, add Razor component, and here we go, child component. Now this is another undocumented feature of the latest Visual Studio Preview. It's going to sit here forever. Here's the trick. Close it and open it again. Ta-da! All right, here's the code for my component. Now, as far as markup goes, I've got a div, and I've set an inline style here with some padding, a background color of light gray so it stands out, and we know that this is a component. I've got a parent message here that I'm just displaying, and a button that calls update message. So let's look at these things here. All right, in the code block, the parent message is a string property, but it's got this parameter attribute. Excuse me. And parameter means I want to expose this to the parent. All right. I can specify what these parameters are. I can bind to these parameters. Like these are essentially, you know, publicly accessible parameters. on a component. Look at how simple making an event handler, or not an event handler, but an event, defining an event is. Event callback of whatever you're passing, right? There's no event args. You don't have to use a base class. You don't have to worry about threading, right? Updating something in a different thread. None of that. So our event is called message changed. It is a parameter so that we can handle that event in the host, in the parent. And update message, we made it asynchronous just by changing void to async task, whereas in the counter it wasn't asynchronous. But since we're going to invoke this method, we're calling await message changed, which is my event, dot invoke async, and passing the parent message, which I have changed to Blazor. Now, how do we call this? We're going to add an instance of that child component right here. And let me just get rid of all of this in the index page. Here it is. The only thing that's different about this is the child component instance. And we're handling this event with binding. We don't have to have an event handler. If all we want that event for is to update the client, all right, and it's just one item, that's it. That's all I have to do. I'm binding the parent message property of child component to message, okay? And I'm saying the event that pushes that change is going to be message changed. So whenever message changed happens, I'm updating message. The parent message changes here, it changes here, and it changes here. So here we go. Changing from parent. Now if I click the change message from within the component, Blazor, boom, boom, boom. It ripples up because of that binding syntax. Now just look at that. Look at how elegant that is. That's code I want to write everywhere, not just on the web. They've really simplified things, but yet made it very powerful. All right, so let's talk about state. If you're going to even consider an application in Blazor server, you need to have some sort of state management strategy. Now, let's think about web forms, right? Web forms has the session object, which persists for the length of the however long the session is. It times out after a while, right? But it's per client kind of a place where you can just store things. It's the dictionary where you can just store stuff for each client. Well, .NET Core has a similar idea of scoped services, but it's not prescriptive. It's not opinionated. It doesn't make you use, like the session object does, either SQL Server or a state server or whatever. It is just a class. You need to persist that object wherever you want. But here's the thing. For stuff that's in the page, it's going to get blown away right away when you navigate to it. So let's look again at the counter. The counter has this page level variable current count, right? Well, if the page gets reinitialized every time I navigate to it, then if I go to the counter, right, and I update it, now it's 8, and I go back home and I go to the counter again, I kind of want to expect that to be where I left it, just because I went to some page, right? So step one is let's move this out of the page and into a scoped service. So scoped services, there's one instance per client, and that's what makes it work. So I'm going to add a class, and you can call it whatever you want. I'm calling it app state. And app state's going to have a single public property, an int called counter. Now I'm going to go to the startup, all right, and I'm going to add that as a scoped service. And that means one instance per client. Now, if I add it as a singleton, I get one instance that's shared among all clients. That would not be good for state. If we did app state with a counter, we'd go in, one user would go in, update the counter, another user would come in, it'd already be set, and then we could continue updating it. So, yeah, not all that good. So the weather forecast service is a singleton because it's just returning some data, random data, actually. And this is in the data folder on Blazor server, right? Here's the model weather forecast, and then the service just gives us some data. So there's another type, which is transient, which is essentially just like page level variables. They just vanish. All right, so how do we access that instance? Well, how we do it is injecting it. Now, inject doesn't mean instantiate. It means inject. The instantiation part comes from what kind of service it is. This is a scoped service. So every page I inject app state, whatever the variable is I want to call it for that page, whatever page I access that from, it's going to be the same instance of the object, right? That's really cool. Lends itself perfectly to a session type of thing. So I can get rid of this current count here altogether, and I'll actually increment app state counter, and I want to show app state counter here. So as I said before, this is step one. Get data out of the page, because when the page refreshes, it's hammered, it's toast. All right, here I go fetch data, and I go home, and I come back to counter, and it's still 5. And I can pick up where I left off. Now, if I refresh the whole page, yeah, it gets reinitialized, because that app state, the whole services, all those services get added again when you're basically starting over, right? So let's talk about persisting. How do we persist that data? So you need to persist and recall that state with your own code. In other words, just because you have that app state, there isn't any, as I said, opinionated way to do this. You can store it in local storage, for example, which is an area of the browser that's protected. And, for small amounts of data, a few K, Steve Sanderson says, maybe 5K, something like that, worth of data you can put in there. Now, if you want an example of how to do that, the shopping cart demo that I wrote in this blog post, and you can download the code and run it too. It basically has a local storage provider which loads and saves the shopping cart, and it's all in one thing, right? So we have access to a shopping cart, we can save the changes, and we can load them from local storage. And there's a timeout, and by default it's 30 seconds. This is just arbitrary in my code, right? And it's 30 seconds because it's a good demo. I can show you how, it expired after 30 seconds, the shopping cart goes away. But to do the demo, you add a few items to your shopping cart with quantities or whatever, and then you just close the app. And then you load it again, and your shopping cart is still there if it was within 30 seconds. If you reload it after 30 seconds, it's all gone. But of course, you can change that interval, right? That's the whole point. You can also use a database outside of your project. I like how my arm just kind of goes away, right? That's neat. I like that. I can do this too. Now you can see the box that I'm in. Help me. Okay. So for a database, you probably don't want to use SQL Server to store state information. It's not relational. you have a key, which is your user ID, and that's it. So a document database is going to be much cheaper, much easier for you, and probably a lot faster as well. So a document database somewhere, local storage, these are options of places where you can store state. But the key is, and this is what I hope you understand, it's up to you. You do you, right? You persist that where you want. All right, this is perhaps the coolest thing that I'm going to show you today. Maybe not, but I think it's cool. Steve Sanderson showed this off at NDC London just in January. And it's a way to develop a Blazor client or Blazor WebAssembly and a Blazor server app at the same time with the same code base. So you essentially share the code that's running in the client project with the server. You do that with a reference. And now when you run the server app, it's running on the server, but it's running the code from the client app. Okay? And now you can set multiple startup projects so that you can run both at the same time, side by side. And this is a good way for you to be able to hedge your bets on which hosting model you want, right? If you develop it this way, it forces you to make sure that the resources in both environments are the same, in the browser and on the server. And it also gives you two apps with two different hosting models when you're done. And you can just pick and choose which one you want to go with. Or you could do something silly like run WebAssembly as the default project, and if you notice that it's IE11 or an unsupported browser, you can route them over to the server version of it, right? So rather than read the slides to you, let's actually do this. Let me close all this stuff because it's going to get confusing. Now, what I'm going to do here is, I could just delete all these pages, but this code isn't going to run. It's going to be here on the server. The server is going to load and run this markup in code, but it's going to run on the server. So the way to do that is you add a project reference from the server app to Blazor WASM client and Blazor WASM shared, because remember, that's where models are. So we need both of those. Now here's the real magic. Remember I told you about host? We don't need that. Underscore host.cshtml. Maybe I didn't. Maybe that was this morning. So underscore host CSHTML in a server application is where the top level HTML gets defined, where you define your CSS and links and all of that stuff, all the stuff that goes in the header. But look at the body. Starting from the body has the script. All right, this is the Blazor server JavaScript that is going to hook the DOM and run all of the stuff through SignalR for you. All of this right here is for error handling, right? And if you're in production, it says an error has occurred, the application may no longer respond, please reload. And then if you're in development or debug mode, an unhandled exception has occurred, see browser tools for whatever. All right, but this right here is what I really want to show you. This is the entirety of your application, of your markup in code, and it comes down to this app class. That contains all the markup and all the code. That's the key. We need to change that to Blazor WASM.client.app. Now we're going to run the client-side code on the server. I'm also going to turn off pre-rendering. There's two options here for render mode, server and server pre-rendered. If it's pre-rendered, then it renders once when it runs and then again when a client connects to it. And there's no such pre-rendering on the Blazor client, so we're turning that off. Okay, now I think, oh yeah, I have to set the multiple startup projects in the solution properties. So I want to run Blazor server and I want to run Blazor WASM server at the same time when I start up. There you go. So let's run this, hope for the best. Here's one. This is Blazor WASM. You can tell that because right up there in the tab says Blazor WASM, and over here it says Blazor server, but this is definitely not the code that's running on the server, that was on the server side. Remember I did the counter thing where you could, with app state come back, and nope, that isn't working, and this certainly isn't my binding code. This is the code from the client project. So let's go down on the WASM side and make sure everything works. Yep. Fetch data. That works. And in the WASM side, this is actually going to making an API call. Whereas on the server side, it was, calling a local service. So this is going to be interesting to see what happens here. Yeah, I thought so. An unhandled exception has occurred. See browser for details. Well, okay, let's do that. And we find that here's the big exception right there. There's no registered service of type HTTP client, which is required to call the web API. And it's because we didn't need it before, right? That's why. Oh, and by the way, look, I try to click, I can't do anything. Your app is done because Blazor has severed the connection, which is really important because if you have an unhandled exception, your app, who knows what state it's in. It could be used as a vector for an attack, right? So we want to shut it down. So here's the reason we have problems. First of all, if you go over to what we were running on the server for fetch data, it's just injecting the weather forecast service, which is a singleton. And then in our uninitialized async, which happens right when the page first initializes, we're overriding that. We're calling get forecast async from our forecast service, which lives up here in data land, right there. On the client side, however, we don't have such things. We are using an HTTP client to call an API with get JSON async, and the URL is relative. So we have two problems. The first problem is the one that we saw in the browser, that we don't know what HTTP is because we don't have access to it. We didn't need it. So I'm going to go back to the server, startup, and add that services.add-scoped system.net.http client. Okay, now when the server runs this version of fetch data, at least it will be able to inject HTTP client. Next, we got to get rid of this relative URL. That isn't going to work at all. So where is this calling actually? Well, it's calling Blazor WASM server. In the controllers, there's this weather forecast controller. That's what it's calling. If you look at that, it's just an API controller. Right? So different architecturally. Remember I told you when you're running Blazor WebAssembly, you want to get all of your data through an API call. That's why we can't just load up a service that does random stuff. I mean, we could do that, but this is the way to fetch data in a Blazor WebAssembly application. So let's find out what the URL is. Well, we know it's localhost on some port, but we don't know what port it is. So I'm going to go into the properties and launch settings JSON, and I see that the SSL port is 44328. Thank you very much. I'll copy that. And now go back to fetch data and change this to a fully qualified URL, https colon localhost colon SSL port. Make sure you use HTTPS there. And now everything should be hunky-dory, hunky, happy, happy, joy, joy. All right, here's our Blazor server. Fetch data, works just fine. And of course, the client doesn't care if it's a complete URL, right? Or not, it just works. So the moral of the story is you have to have, yeah, it's fine to share code, but the environment that that code is running in has to have access to the same services, same NuGet packages, the same JavaScript, okay? If you're going to add JavaScript, that runs in the browser. So if you're going to add JavaScript, you have to add it in both environments. Makes sense, right? Anyway, I think this is a wicked cool technique, and I use it in the band booker application, which I showed you, which I'm going to show you right now, actually. Any questions on this that Don hasn't already answered? It looks like he's been busy answering your questions. That's great. Good. Okay. All right, let's talk about Band Booker. So Band Booker is an application that came out of necessity for me. Turned out to be not wildly received by my band. But here's the story of Band Booker. I basically have a 10-piece band, okay? And the 10-piece band is hard to get together for rehearsals because, you know, everybody has to decide on what the rehearsals are and when to do it, when to rehearse. Try booking a gig. What ends up happening is a venue will call me and say, hey, we have a possible gig for you on this date or maybe this date. Which of these dates can you play? And so I will then email the guys in the band and all the guys, you know, because we have like 3 different guys who sub on sax, for example, a couple different other horn players, whatever. So I'll send them all who can play, right? Email. And usually the first day, 2 or 3 people say, yes, I can do it. And the rest of them I have to hound. Like I have to contact them by text. I have to call them, whatever. I have to consistently email them constantly. So I came up with this idea when I was learning Blazor to teach myself, you know, a real world application with data, with authentication, authorization, with all the techniques that including my own SignalR hub, right? And this application is what I teach when I do my 2-day workshop. I'm going to schedule some of these live here pretty soon after I modify the code, but there is a video available of it. That it's the preview before this WebAssembly preview, but it will certainly work. If you go to blazor.appvnext.com, you can get that. But anyway, I'm limiting the demo to 2 models, instruments and musicians. So here are the techniques that I'm going to show you in this demo. Code behind, which means that instead of having a code block in a Razor page, we're going to move that into its own class. We're going to do input validation, right? So if we don't pass validation, we can't input. JavaScript interop, you mentioned the focus. Somebody mentioned how to set focus. Yes, I can show you how to do that. It's exactly what I use it for. And then generic components. So you can build your own reusable components that work across different data types. I'll show you that as well. I'm also using Chris Sainty's code and technique for doing API controllers for authentication. And the login controller returns a JOT token, which you then store in local storage in the browser. And that is your sort of authentication token so that the next time you run, it pulls it out of local storage and authorizes you and you're in, or authenticates you and you're in. For authorization, there isn't much in this application except to show or hide UI based on whether you're logged in. But in my big project, we do role-based authentication, and I use an open source tool called Identity Manager to manage users and roles, and it's easy to use. And you just download it and point it to your auth database, make a few changes, and then it's good to go. All right, so let's see what that looks like. Here I've got it running already. This is the WASM version on the left and the server version on the right. I have logged out in the WASM version because I wanted to show you what you see when you're not logged in. Please register or log in to use this app. And if I do log in, then I can do exactly what I could do over here on the server. I can see the data and I can do my CRUD operations. And that's what this is really about. It's about managing instruments and managing musicians that play those instruments. So first of all, UI-wise, notice that my edit and delete buttons are disabled until I actually select something. And then I can edit or delete. Makes sense? Also, notice that when I edit, not only do I have focus in the name property of this component, but it's also selected. So if I just start typing over it, it's going to modify, right? Now, I've tabbed off of it and it says name is too long. This is the validation. And if I press update, nothing happens. Likewise, if I don't have anything in here at all, the name field is required. That message shows up. And of course I can cancel. So let's delete an instrument. Let's add a new instrument. And there you see the focus again. Just to be clear, everything that you see in gray here is a component called instrument editor in this case. And in this case, it's called musician editor. So the musician editor, like so, has the same sort of look and feel to it, but it's also got this generic component, and this is called object picker. And if I double click on an item over here, it adds it to the selected instrument list, or back. I can add all, remove all, right? Piano Patty's gonna play keyboards, obviously. So there I can update her. I can add a new musician. I have a percussionist named Che. We'll add him. Remove guitar. We want congas. There it is. So if I go look at Che, he plays congas. All right. So that's pretty much the extent of this application, but it is a real application. Unlike the one that I show in my 2-day class, this doesn't have data storage or persistence for these instruments and musicians. They're just loaded up in memory so that you can get the hang of accessing them in the UI. And of course, I'm using the same, technique that I just showed of creating both hosting models at the same time. So let's start in the index. I've got an authorized view, and this is a component in Blazor. It has two subcomponents, authorized and not authorized. And in authorized, that's all the UI that gets shown if the user has been logged in. Otherwise, not. And you can easily attach roles to these things, so UI only gets shown if they're in a particular role. Take a look at this instrument list. It's just a select. All right, it looks like a list box, but I've got the size 10. That means it's not a drop-down list. It's an actual list box looking list box. And I've got my onChange handler, instrument selected, and a disabled Boolean that I can use to disable it. Whenever I'm adding a new or editing, I disable the list so that somebody can't select another instrument. Okay, and then I'm displaying all the instruments in this master list of instruments here, one at a time with a for each. And so this is a really good example of using Boolean expressions to show particular UI. So for each instrument and instruments, I'm checking to see if the instrument is the selected instrument, which I set when you click on an instrument. And if it is, I'm going to use the selected attribute here. And the reason I do that is because I want to be able to set the selected instrument with code, not just when you click on something. For example, if I add a new instrument, after I add it, I want it to be selected, right? So that's how that works. And now I have my buttons, new instrument button click. Let's actually click that. And before we get into the instrument editor component, let's go to new instrument button click. So this is code behind. This is actually a class called index.razor.cs. So it's the name of the Razor page. Use the convention, add a CS to it. You also have to make it a partial class and derive from component base, which is in this namespace here, Microsoft ASP.NET Core Components. And then any member that you want to access from the markup needs to be protected. At least protected. Could be public also. All right, so where were we? We were in new instrument button click. Right, so we've set some enabling and disabling. The selected instrument is set to a new instrument. And then we await instrument editor.new instrument. What is instrument editor? That is a reference to our UI instrument editor. And how do we get that? With this little guy right there, @ref equals. @ref equals. Remember that. So now instrument editor is a reference to the instantiated component in the UI. And what I do when I say new instrument button click, I call the instrument editor's new instrument method. And new instrument is here on instrument editor. I've got a Boolean show instrument panel that I turn on and off if I want to show it or hide it. Now here's the new instrument method that I called from index. And I've got a Boolean adding, whether it's true or not, because I use this same component for adding and updating. I have the submit button text that goes in the button that you push. It's either add or update. I'm creating a new instrument, setting show instrument panel to true, and then I call set focus with a JavaScript interop object, and that is an IJS runtime. So if you want to invoke JavaScript, you inject an IJS runtime. I called mine JS. And then you use js.invoke void async if it doesn't return a value, or if it does return a value, you say invoke async and of whatever the variable type that gets returned is. So let's see what that looks like down in set focus. And this is why we were getting the question, how do we do this? I don't know how to do it. And the answer is, for me anyway, is to call a private function with the same parameters on a timeout. So I'm going to give it 10 milliseconds and then call internal focus. And I'll tell you why I need to do this in a second. But I'm looking for an element reference, and there's a possibility it could be null. Why is that? All right, well, that's what we'll talk about. If it is null, I want to call myself again in another 10 milliseconds and return. So just keep calling this internal focus every 10 milliseconds until I get a reference. And when I have a reference, then I'll call focus and select. Here's why I have to do this. Starting with new instrument button click, I call instrument editor new instrument, and new instrument invokes this JavaScript right after setting show panel equal to true. Well, show panel is equal to false at the moment, which means this input, which this is just a validation version of this, right? With the ID instrument.name doesn't exist. It's not in the DOM yet, right? So that's why we have to wait and keep retrying until it's actually there. Now, there is another potential way that you could handle this, which is what I think the guy who was asking the question, or the person who was asking the question, was saying they couldn't figure out. There is an override and a virtual method here called on after render. And on after render happens in every component or page after the page has been rendered. So that would guarantee, if I called focus here, it would guarantee that that element exists. However, you're going to call focus every time the page renders. What happens if you press a key? Oh, the page renders. Focus again. You can never actually edit. So now you have to do all sorts of crazy logic in here to figure out when to set focus. No, that's crazy. That's asking for trouble, if you ask me. So this is, this is, I think, a much more elegant solution. You, again, have to have the same JavaScript in both places. This is actually in the client, and it's in www.root index.html, and then, of course, on the server, and you can see that I've actually removed all the other pages, but underscore host.cshtml, that's where I put my JavaScript, but it has to be the same. Now, it doesn't have to return the same value, but it has to be the same. For example, if you wanted to write a function, where am I, that returned a string, client or server, on the server side version, it would return server, and on the client side version, it would return client. But it could be called from either environment because it's the same code and it's the same interface. But that's an easy hack while you're developing this code to figure out whether you're running on the server or on a client. Okay? Let's talk about the musician editor, because the musician editor has this object picker in it, and I'll get back to validation, okay? The object picker allows you to select from all instruments a list of selected instruments, but it doesn't necessarily need to be instruments. In fact, the reason I made it generic is because in the Big Band Booker, I have a list of bands, and the bands, every band has a list of musicians, right? So I use that to select musicians. So here are the parameters. We have all items, which is, well, I'll tell you what that is, but we're passing in all instruments, and then instrument gets derived as the type. Selected items is musician instruments, or the instruments that belong to this musician. All right, these item type and item type plural are just strings that we use for UI purposes to identify what we're looking at. And then the name of the text property of an instrument is name, and the name of the value property is ID. So looking at object picker, this is what makes it generic. At type param T item. T item becomes your T, becomes your data type. And you can see all items is nothing more than a list of T item, as is selected items. And then the item that gets selected is also a T item. So how do we get data in and out? If you look, this is just a table with a couple list boxes. The first one is all instruments, right? All items. And we're using these helpers item value and item text. And I look at those, and we're just doing reflection, folks. We have the value property name, we have the text property name. We're just getting the values of those properties. with reflection. Cool. So that is essentially how you do a generic component. Now, in the musician editor, you can see I instantiate it just like any other component. That's not all that interesting. Well, let's go back to the instrument editor that has the validation. This edit form right here is required if you're going to do validation. This is a Blazor component that has validation stuff built into it. You give it the model that you're editing, and this is actually an instance of the model. Edit instrument is an instance, so that's right down here. It's an instrument. You can see that. And on valid submit, and here's a method that handles the button submit. Now, why don't we just have on our submit button, you know, on click equals submit button pressed, because validation has to be passed, right? It has to pass the validation checks before we can allow that to be called. That's why when the name was too long, I was hitting update and nothing happened, right? And we saw the error. Well, that error comes from this right here, the validation summary. This data annotations validator says, I want you to use the annotations on the models themselves, on the model itself, to determine what the rules are. So let's go take a look at the instrument class. And here it is. There are the rules. We're using system component model data annotations here, and we have two on the name property. One, that it's required, and two, that the maximum length is 50. And there are all sorts of data annotations if you haven't used them, for email addresses, for phone numbers, all sorts of cool stuff. So then I told you input text is essentially this input, but in with validation. And the rest of it's pretty self-explanatory. The only thing else I want to point out is I have a cancel button. I actually had to say type equals button here, otherwise the DOM thinks it's a submit button. Okay. Let's see. JavaScript interop. Code behind, validation, generic components. I think I just want to show you briefly the authorization and authentication methods that we have going on here. Starting with the controllers. So there's two controllers. Accounts controller is for registering. Login controller is for logging in. The login controller is the interesting one here, because this guy, when we have models, we have a login model and a login result model. The login result includes this token, a JOT security token, that has our claims, right? Our name, which is the email that we logged in with, and expiration, and creds, which is essentially just a GUID in our app config file. I can show that to you right here. This JOT security key is just a GUID. And then the issuer and the audience, the expiration, all those things are in config. So where does that happen? Okay, on the client, we have this auth service. And the auth service is what we call with the client to log in and to register and to log in. And you can see that if we get the right result, you know, we're successful. We're calling set item async on this local storage object that gets injected in. And that saves in local storage with a key of auth token. We also have this API authentication state provider that is a ancestor of authentication state provider, and this combines our HTTP client with local storage so that we can do things like mark the user as authenticated, right, and mark them as logged out. And then we have a couple of pages. Here's our login page, and again you can see here's one thing that's interesting that we've done here. we have our auth service here, and that's all cool. I'll come back to this thought that I had. So we've got essentially, the same as we had before in input text. We're doing validation, and this is the difference between a validation message and a validation summary. We're actually showing a message on a per control level with validation message. So there's login, and now look at the code behind login. Well, the code block, right? Handle login happens. We're calling through the auth service login, passing the login model, which is what we're editing right here, login model. Okay, and if it was successful, we're going to navigate to the main page, the root. This is what I wanted to show you here. In app.razor, we're using an authorized route view rather than a route view. And cascading authentication state instead of whatever the not found is. So this is really cool stuff. And without getting too deep into it, Chris Sainty is the guy that made all this stuff happen. He sanctified the use of his code for us and for me, and I would definitely follow his blog. He's a brilliant guy and also an MVP, and he's really into Blazor. I'm going to skip that slide, but here's something that you need to know. If you're deploying a Blazor server application to Azure, you need to make sure that WebSockets is enabled on your app service. And I just checked this out yesterday. I published from a new project and created in Visual Studio a new app service. And I went and looked, and yes, WebSockets was enabled. So they did something to update that in the last Visual Studio preview. All right, let's talk about our sponsor, DevExpress. And if you take a look at this, I think it will hit home to you how using their controls really helps you get stuff done soon, right? Quickly. That's what they're all about. They're about power and productivity. So they have all these great controls that you can just go check out demos of. And I'll show you these demos right here. Online, you can go to devexpress.com, support demos. And they have some demos for Blazor, including this one here, the scheduler. Let's start with this, because this is, talk about power. This is like dropping Google Calendar into your project. Look at this. I can overlap appointments. I can click and edit appointments. I can change their date and their time, their location, the repeat stuff is all of there. It's like all of the stuff that you know and love about Google Calendar is in the scheduler. Here I can add my own appointment. And of course I can make that longer because I like my coffee. Now, you've seen this. All of this in this little bit of markup and this little bit of code. OMFG, right? Talk about productivity, that I can just take something that's completely self-contained and just give it my data source and put it in. It's amazing. Amazing. So they have a lot of different data grid samples here too. Paging and scrolling. Paging is really important in a Blazor server application, especially because you don't want to load up lots and lots of data. And here's a really good example, a large data source. So there's a lot of records here. Definitely not something that you would want to do. So the virtualization of data throughout all their Blazor controls is a common theme. Now I want to show you an application that the Developer Express guys wrote for this particular road show, desk show. They took my band booker app and said, okay, Carl, we're going to do the same functionality that you do in your band booker app, but we're going to use grids. And these are the DX grids. Okay. Instruments here, new instrument. Musicians here, new musician. Let's add a new instrument, and I'll call this a conga, and I'll update that. And let's delete drums, and maybe we'll edit bass, and I'll call this bass guitar. So now you've seen the creds, the CRUD for instruments. Here's the CRUD for musicians. Here we'll create a new musician. Again, I'll call him Che. And then if I click this, that's sort of like a drop-down list, right? And I can pick the instruments, and you can see the ones I picked in there. And then also I can add more instruments, and now you see they're being removed from the drop-down list. So Che plays conga. There you go. And of course I can delete and edit musicians as well. Now here's the cool part about this demo. There's the markup for instruments, right? You can see this coming, right? Here's the markup for musicians, which includes that drop-down list. Here's the code to support instruments, all the CRUD code. And here's the CRUD code to support musicians. That's pretty cool, huh? All right, there's one more demo that I want to show you, and that is a multi-select list box. Now, this is, let me just run this application. This is my coronavirus shutdown reading list. So these are books that I want to read: Practical Snow Melting for Fun and Profit, How to Shave a Cat, and Winning at Tic-Tac-Toe. Now this is a single select list box, just like, you know, the select that I've used in all my other demos. Now wouldn't it be cool if you could just say multiple here like you can in HTML, and in JavaScript you can handle that just fine. Well, it turns out in Blazor right now anyway, this change event args that gets passed only gives you the last one you clicked on. Yes, I would be able to get multiple selected items in the list by doing control click, but I only get the last one. So long story short, it's really hard to do, and it can be done though, and I know it can be done because this guy did it. This is an open source by default because it's on his blog post and he gives the code away. It's a multi-select list box component. And look at this. The guy's name is AshKE98. And here's the link to his blog post. And I would definitely go check his stuff out. I'm giving him props. He did it. But it's pretty complex. Let's see. So here it is, a generic component, because he's got the type param t item, and he's injecting a JavaScript interop object. And he's got his options in here and some cascading value for the child content. This is all stuff that's not very intuitive, right? That you would have to do just to get a multiple select list box. He's got some type conversion stuff here, and he's handling on after render async, and he's invoking some JavaScript here. And this is interesting. He's got actually a JS invocable attribute, which means he can call this method from JavaScript. This is part of JavaScript interop, going the other way. So let's look at his JavaScript. Here it is in _host CSHTML. Here's the drop-down function, which, if you think about it, has a lot of cyclomatic complexity. 3 levels of if, and a for loop with an if in it, and he's getting selected values right here. And this guy right here is calling invoke method async on the .NET object on option select, which if you go back in here, that's what this is. All of that just to get a multi-select list box. Well, here's the thing. DevExpress has a list box control, and it's very easy to use the multi-select feature of it And here to show us that in its entirety is Don Webier. Don, how are you?
Hey Carl,
Hey.
that was a decent amount of work getting that multi-select feature enabled. But fortunately, there are easier ways of doing so by using the native DevExpress Blazor controls. And let me show you how simple that works. I have this page over here and I have only prepared this property which will hold the selected books of the list box. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to insert the DevExpress list box here where I will bind the data to the book service, and I'll specify a text field name which will be in this case the property name which will be displayed inside the list box. And then the last thing is I'm going to bind the selected items of the list box to the selected books property of the page. And this is basically all we need right now. Let me also include the code that you've seen before. There is one difference though, and that is instead of cycling through this list with IDs and stuff, you can now cycle directly through the selected books collection.
Right.
And you can write out those property names straight away. So it's again a bit less code here. And once I run the application, let's see what happens now. If I go to the DevExpress demo, what we'll see is that we have the same UI as we had on the previous pages. The only thing right now is that if I hold down the Shift key or the Control key, it still selects one. And that's actually quite simple solved, because right now the list box is in single selection mode. If I go back to the code and I'll add a property which I will change to the list box selection mode multiple, we're all set.
Yep.
So let's run a demo again, and I will now be using my Control and my Shift key as well. And what you'll see is I can select items individually,
Nice.
or deselect them, or I can even hold the Shift key to select the whole batch. So that's quite simple, huh?
Yeah.
And there is one more thing I'd like to show, and that is setting another property. And that property is going to be show checkboxes. I'm going to put it to true, and now all of you may guess what this will do. So let's run it again, and what we have now is a really nice list box with checkboxes. And
Nice.
for signal selections I don't even need to hold down the Control key, but I can still use the Shift key if I want. So if I want to select the whole batch, I'll just hold down the Shift. So a very nice and powerful control.
Yeah.
And yeah, if we check the amount of code that was needed to get this desired UI, I would say this is too much, right?
No, it's just the right amount of code. Hey, thanks, Don. Thanks very much.
You're welcome, Carl, and we'll talk later.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye. So there's two ways that you can run DevExpress Blazor demos online, like I just showed you, and also locally. You can download the source, and there's a GitHub repo here. You just download the source code and run it all locally. It's good for running that large data set virtual grid demo, right, against your own huge data set. To use DevExpress tools, you're going to register. You have to do that. I mean, they've been telling you the link. It's devexpress.com/freeblazor. And once you do that, you'll be taken to a page which shows you how to configure your own private NuGet feed, install the package, add the CSS link, and then import using devexpress.blazor, and you're off to the races. Now there's a couple of resources online at DevExpress that you can use to keep up with their Blazor goings on. One is the Blazor roadmap. You can keep up with the latest developments. Also, there's a Blazor community portal where there's new discoveries are posted, and there's a blog there. And of course, get in touch. Blazor Roadshow at devexpress.com will work. Blazor at devexpress.com will work. Blazor Desk Show at devexpress.com will work. Just say hi. And definitely go download your free copy today. Hey, listen, I want to thank you very much for watching this Blazor Desk Show. And the video will be up here online on YouTube and I believe on Twitch as well for forever. So go ahead, go get your free Blazor controls, and thanks again for watching. This is Carl Franklin signing off for the Blazor Desk Show. Bye-bye.